Have you ever wondered, are you really making the best decision out of all your options? Or are we only living under the illusion that we made the right choice? Are us humans all disconnected individuals, or are we all more or less interlinked in some way? Can we really explain an experience to someone who has never experienced it before? These are the questions that shape how we perceive the world.
Joshua,
Hi, I'm Telia.
and welcome to our podcast, The Uncommon Senses, where we reflect on the nature of knowledge and on how we know what we claim to know. So, hi everyone, once again, welcome. For those who are new to our podcast, we are two university students who have endured 2 years of IBDP education, and we're here to share more of our experience as well as our thoughts. So far in the episode, we have gone through what senses are, essentially the tools we use to experience the world around us. We've talked about how our senses could fool us sometimes, causing what we may call illusions. But sometimes we could be fooled even though our senses are working perfectly, which brings us to our topic today, how the world around us could obscure the truth from us. Recently, in the business communications class that I took in university, we explored a technique known as framing. So, in order to bring this technique to life, let's do a really small experience really quickly. So, let's say you wanted to buy a product like a camera, and there are two available. One is $5,000 and has 50% off, and another one has $3,000 and you get $500 off. So, Talia, I'm interested. Which one would you buy given these options?
I personally would definitely pick the $5,000 and 50% off one, because it seems like you have saved more because you've saved 50%. Like this product was worth $5,000 and now you're getting half the price, and that seems like a really good deal. But then looking at the $3,000 and you only get $500 off, is only like a much smaller percentage, much less than like 50%. So then you feel like it's better, even though, I mean, mathematically, I know the cost of these two cameras are like exactly the same. But yeah, just $5,000 and 50% off seems like a better deal.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you went straight with the mathematical point of view, because I understand that that's your major in university, and yeah, and I mean you're completely right. I mean most people would choose the one with the 50% off, and as carrying on from what we've discussed from last episode, we've talked about how human beings, we have this natural ability to compare different things in order to figure out the best option for us. And we've talked about how this could be an evolutionary instinct to ensure our own survival in the wild, to ensure that we have the best chances to survive. And yeah, and you and along with a lot of other people, you're right, a lot of people choose the option with 50% off just because it sounds like you get a better deal. And the same goes to why sometimes items are priced differently. uh, they have prices where they have something point 99 to make them seem cheaper. And the main idea is that how we present truths or data affects the way we feel about them. And this is known as forced perspective in TOK. And it is when things are conditioned so you see things in a specific way, intentionally or unintentionally or not. So another example you see in daily life, and that's an example that we usually talk about, is the idea of a truncated graph. So it's essentially a graph which they amplify the differences between each variant to make the graph seems like there's a bigger difference between each. But when you're putting all the data together, aligning them together, and you compare them, essentially the graph shows the same level of data. So there isn't really as big of a difference than people would have thought just by observing a graph. So yeah, you see these examples everywhere, and it is used in different situations like advertisement or education. There are a lot of different, yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
different, methods that people use to try to make you think a certain way. And certainly, as we've discussed before, there's the idea of how social constructs could affect the way we see things. And I think these definitely plays into a sort of like technique or strategies to get you to have a to see things in a certain way that they certain people intended it to be. And an example could be seen from an experiment known as the crash car experiment done by Dr. Loftus and Palmer in 1974. Essentially, what they did is that they took some participants and showed them some films of car crashes. And later, when they're asked how the participants would rate the severity of the car crash, they found out that participants tend to give a higher rating when wordings such as smashed or collided are used, but they tend to give a lower rating when words such as contracted or hit were used. So, as you can see, these words are they differ in the way of severity. So when you use words such as smashed or collided, people tend to conjure up an image of a higher severity. It seems like something disastrous has happened. But when we use wording such as contracted or hit, it tends to be of a lower severity, and it sounds like the car merely grazed upon each other. And this experiment shows that how valuable our memories are, but more importantly, it shows how wordings and diction could subconsciously influence our thinking. So here we could use the term modality to describe this phenomenon, which means the particular mode or language that something exists in or is expressed in. So, as you can see so far, we've explored how the environment or external stimuli could affect our senses. However, in other times, how we think internally could also have a huge impact on the way we explore the world. An experiment could be seen from a psychological experiment known as the Sally-Ann test, which is also known as the false belief test. In this experiment, children are shown two fictional characters, Sally and Anne. Sally has a basket while Anne has a box. Sally places a ball
in the basket,
and Anne notices this. While Sally is gone, Anne moves the ball back to the box. And the question that's asked within this experiment is that where would Sally look for the ball after she returns? So Telia, I know this experiment is designed for little children, but how would you answer this question?
I mean, since Sally placed the ball in her own basket, right, and then Anne moved that ball from Sally's basket back to her own box. So, because Sally doesn't know that Anne has moved the box, so Sally is possibly going to look into her very own basket first and see, because she doesn't know that Anne moved the ball back to her own box, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I also remember, like, we definitely talked about this in class, and I think something kind of interesting is, like, this kind of just illustrates the sense of, like, your own self and, like, your perception on yourself and everything.
I think the main point about this experiment is to able to identify with to understand the idea that people may not understand or think the same way as you do. And I think that this also plays with the idea of empathy and sympathy, and this natural tendency for human beings to kind of to think from a perspective of another person. And of course, like, as normal people, we have this ability to think from another's point of view, and it's very important in a lot of especially humanitarian work or a lot of surface sector works that people do. And it's another thing is that this sort of ability is actually kind of a mystery to scientists or to sociologists, because if you think about it, human beings in the wild, to be honest, we're just looking for our own interest. We're looking for our own we're ensuring our own survival. So this idea of empathy, selflessness, and also like self-sacrifice is actually quite a mystery to researchers, because they don't really give individuals the best chance of survival. So it's quite a unknown that they're not quite sure how these really plays into our own ability to survive, and why these even exist in the first place. And so, like, back to the experiment. So, what experiments found is that children before the age of 4 thinks that Sally would look for the ball in the box. This is due to the false assumption that Sally could see what they saw, and they do not understand what other people may see or experience different things than they do. In other words, they think that everyone sees the world the same way as they do, which of course isn't true, as we're all individuals with our own um, experience and with our own way of seeing things. And we'll explore this more on later when we talk about phenomenalist reality and the different forms of reality that people may use to see the world. And experiment um, also found out that after the age of 4, children could answer that Sally would look for the ball in the basket, as they could understand that Sally did not see Anne place the ball in the box in the first place. And this ability to understand what other people may think and how those thoughts may be different from ours is known as the theory of mind. So, on the surface, this seems like a good thing. So, understanding what others are thinking could aid us in giving appropriate responses. Like, we're able to collect more, context when we're doing conversations or when we're trying to, interact with other people. So, however, a problem emerges when our assumptions are wrong. So sometimes we can misjudge what other people are thinking. So this ability is not, foolproof. So has this ever happened to you, Telia, where you think that someone is happy or sad when they're actually not?
Oh, okay, this is an interesting question. Because I think your mention on emotions of happy or sadness is definitely related to emotions as a way of knowing, because a lot of the times, like, these emotions can be very universal, like it's kind of like written on their faces. But definitely there are times that happen where, like, after a certain event that has happened to a certain person, I would assume that they will feel happy or they would feel sad, but turns out they might think otherwise because of their personal experiences. So when I'm kind of giving my response, or like I'm trying to interact with them, their reactions to what I try to tell them can be a little bit different from what I intended. So yeah, I think this event definitely happened to me before, and I think to a lot of people as well.
Yeah, actually, I think I share a similar experience in that I remember when I was young. So my family always have this face, like this face where you give when you're expressionless, you don't have any emotions. But to a young self, to me that's like a sign of angry, or like if you're not happy, you must be sad, or if you don't show emotions of joy, you must be having some other sort of emotion. So I didn't understand that people have, like, sometimes just have, like, really no emotions at all. They feel normal, and I
Yeah.
always bug my parents with the question about, like, are you sad, are you angry, what did I do, something like that, because to me it's just so I guess also like a kind of influenced by, like, the television media. So when we look at sitcoms, when we look at, like, television, or when we look at movies, we see that actors always have a sort of always have emotions. They are very expressive in the way they act, and I guess that's imprinted in me the idea that people must always have, like, they must always show a certain emotion to represent what they're feeling at the time. But yeah, and I do not understand that sometimes people, as I said, people just feel normal and they have, like, a no emotions whatsoever. And
Yeah.
I guess this also feeds into the idea of the the resting B word face.
B face.
Yeah, B face, where
Right.
some people just have a naturally um, angry looking face when in fact they don't really feel any emotions at all. And I
Yeah.
guess sometimes it's also very hard to, it also brings into the idea of how sometimes it's very hard to judge someone's emotions, because our faces are built differently, and this will definitely will affect our interpretation of someone else's emotions and how they're feeling, because as we've talked about just now, some people are just naturally angry looking, when some people
Yeah.
are they have more calm and, let's say, more approachable faces.
Yeah, I can totally kind of relate to that, or like, especially your point on, like, the media and, like, or TV movies, as well as, like, initially as a child we just think that parents are, like, either angry or sad. So it's kind of like very extreme emotions. Like we just assume that if they are having this resting bee face, then they are either angry or sad. Like we just or other times when they have a smile on their face, they're happy and joyful. And actually, this relates to I think the movie Inside Out. Like I'm kind of currently doing this as my university project. So you see how like Riley, when she was much younger, she's basically she basically just has this whole joy personality, emotion, kind of being the main person, leader, and the control for all of her other small emotions, and kind of overlooking the importance of like sadness, of anger, fear, and disgust. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're not the only emotions that a person has, but yeah, you see how when she was younger, this joy figure kind of dominates her, and kind of like when we were younger. And I think the reason why we think you're either happy or sad with relation to like how TVs portray things, or how young children cartoons kind of portray everything as on the extreme, is either good or is bad. Like we have that idea already imprinted in our minds at a very young age. So I think to talk about this, I think it's really nice to see like movies for children nowadays are definitely becoming better at doing that the world isn't just good or bad. Like from Inside Out, you can see that there's no main like antagonist or like the evil character, but it's more of like Riley's internal emotions, trying to see how they can work well as a team. That this issue is internal, and you have to overcome your internal problems in order to become a better person. And I think nowadays, like the Pixar's, I think, Turning Red, I think that's the new movie, was also, like I haven't watched it. I really want to because it looks so cute. But yeah, I think it's also really about, growing up and really to overcome yourself and your internal problems. I think that is a great giant leap of cartoons designed for younger audiences. We can see how it has evolved from, like 20 years ago to now.
Yes, definitely. I think cartoons are definitely not dumbing down for their audiences anymore, and I think on one part they realize that not only children likes to watch these cartoons. I think people of all different age levels like to enjoy these medias, but also as you've said, society has moved on from the phase that in the idea that thinking, oh, children doesn't know anything. Children, we should be protecting these children from the real world, while actually we should be actually educating them and to really preparing them to become adults in the real world. As after all, they will one day grow up and they will form the, the pillars of our society. So we do have to do a lot of educational work in that regards. On the side note, I'm just interested because so far we've talked about misjudging people's emotions. It's really, the damage is really limited. So we've talked about how we could bug someone or annoy someone if we misjudge someone's emotions. But do you think that doing this have more like a more severe or real life adversities that it could bring out? For example, like when political commenters, they usually will comment about how certain world leaders have certain body language or certain facial emotions that could imply something, but as we've seen, it's not foolproof, it's not infallible. So these analysis could be wrong, and it could lead up to larger implications. It could lead up to larger changes happening. So yeah, do you think these not these misjudges of someone else's emotions could in a way also bring up larger problems in our world today?
Definitely, especially, with political leaders, like people that has so much power and authority in making decisions. And yeah, I think if we just, politics, in terms of human behavior, I think every single human, we're so unique and we're so different. But then at the same time, like human behavior is also so predictable. Like there's definitely psychological reasonings
behind like this, people analyzing, why this leader judges in a particular way. And I think like as we grow up and we possibly have met more people and have more experiences, then I feel like we definitely will pick up better on these, micro expressions that people make, or like these emotions. And I think the important part for like all, I guess, in political world is to really keep an open mind,
Yes, definitely. And one thing I would say is that I think the emotions that world leaders or political figures have shown in recent years is being increasingly explicit, because as you can see, like we have more, would you say, more extreme world leaders in their body
Yes.
language and emotions, such as we have Donald Trump before, and yeah, and you definitely see how the political stage is turning more, to me at least, more reality show like. It's more about the showmanship and more about how you package yourself more than actually creating change, which is kind of sad, but yeah, I guess that's the reality we live in now. And also, just a quick note. What's on the topic of misjudging someone's emotions, it also reminds me of I don't know if you heard this yet, but in Oscar yesterday, the actor Will Smith
Oh,
slapped the host Chris Rock based on a joke on his wife known as J.I. Jane, and definitely perhaps there is like a misjudgment of the the perhaps the actor's attitude, or the actor's how the actor would take the joke. And definitely it's also for pretty misleading at first, because you can some cameras have reported seeing that the actor is seen laughing at the joke made by the
yeah.
host, but then a second later, little do we know, he'll actually engage in a physical altercation. So misjudging someone's emotions and misjudging the environment and how well they tolerate certain responses could also lead to violence and active conflict. And yeah, I think in a nutshell, but this. Although this, as we've learned, this is a very useful skill that has been given to us, and as you've mentioned, it gets better with experience and with practice as we go older. Um, I, it's definitely worth noting that these skills aren't invaluable, and it could lead to disastrous outcomes sometimes if misused, or used wrongly. So and after discussing all that, I guess the main takeaway is that we assume others people may think or feel, um, may what others may think or feel may affect how we perceive their actions. For example, if we think someone is angry, we may see them running towards us as a sign of threat, while they may actually be only excited to see us. So, therefore, how we this really comes to show how we perceive the world around us, or how we perceive someone could actually affect our affect our way of seeing the world, in the way of not directly interacting with our senses, but more so about how this world is perceived and formulates or visualized in our brain. And we'll definitely talk more about this topic when we touch on the topic of phenomenalism in the podcast of where we discuss different types of reality and how we interpret the world. So moving on, back in 2018, I attended a competition called World Scholars Cup, and the theme was an entangled world. So this is a competition about how there's yeah, I think Talia could also tell you, as she also attended it. It's a competition about answering questions, debating, and also writing in groups. So it's a rather academic competition, and usually we'll have a theme where we discuss world issues. And the theme that year is an entangled world, where our focus is on how the people and events around the world is connected, especially in a post-globalized setting. And I remember reading this poem called No Man is an Island by the English poet John Donne, which likened individuals to a piece of the European continent, entwined and interlinked to each other. However, recently I also came across a quote from the English journalist Rudyard Kipling's 1890 novel, The Light That Fell, which says, "We're all islands shouting lies to each other across seas of misunderstanding," which delivers a very different sentiment compared to Donne. So as you can see, both poems, they also liken individuals to sort of like islands, and one talked about how we're, interconnected islands, and they form like the entire continents, and how we're all, an action from one could affect an action from another. While the second poem talks about how we're in essentially isolated islands that have no way of connecting to each other, and it's very hard for us to communicate or reach out. So Talia, which one do you think is more that you're more prone to believe? The notion that all men are united under humanity, that we're all, you know, um, really social animals, we all interact or affect each other in a way, or are we just disconnected individuals under the illusions of establishing any meaningful communication, and that the truth is that we're ultimately isolated with each other, unable to really, unable to really have an actual or significant effect on each other?
Oh, oh, that's interesting. Because for me, I think it's we're both. Because like at the very end, we're social animals, so we are kind of connected. Like we live in communities. We think we are having like we definitely get more benefits from being together than living alone. And yeah, I think that's primarily how like our world has functioned since like the beginning of civilization, basically. However, I think like nowadays we are definitely becoming a little bit more disconnected, I would say. And I think like increasing internet like social media, it's definitely somewhat it definitely has a significance to this whole breakdown of like us connections, because even though internets are originally created to connect people from other places together, but I think now the internet is becoming very powerful, and all of these like so-called algorithms are kind of really breaking us apart, even though they're supposed to give you the best content, but they also makes us more deeply extreme with our ideas and like our beliefs. And so I will say that we should be more connected. Like I think we definitely should try to understand each other and be entangled once again. However, I also do agree that we are also individuals. Like we, even though we live in a community, but then we also have our individuality. We also have we need a sense of self. Like that's pretty much also much needed. So I just feel like for sure we are united because there's actually so many things we share in common than differences. However, I also think that having a sense of individual, knowing yourself, know your value is also important. So, yeah.
Yes, definitely. I really agree with you on that point. And recently, I wrote a paper on globalization, and I guess what we're describing here is, I guess what at least what I called the backlash of connectiveness. So, the idea that too much connection could actually bring forth conflicts, and therefore we tend to kind of retreat back or try to resist this change. We've seen in global context in the sense that some countries are turning to more isolationist policies in order to defend their self-interest and kind of break away from the negative effects brought forth by globalization. And on a smaller scale, you've also seen people of different culture withdrawing from each other, and there's this term called cultural minimization, and this is the sort of idea that people would put they value the similarity that of us as humanity more than the cultural differences that separates us. And in some way that's good. Some people argue that because we are essentially dissolving cultural disparities, we're dissolving cultural barriers, as we seek the similarities that us as humanity brings forth is more important. But some people argue that that's also a bad thing because we're essentially negating the cultural diversity. We're negating the different cultural differences that us coming from different backgrounds exist. So it's really this idea is really up for debate. And also I think it's very interesting that you bring out the idea of social media, internet and social media, because I think in a way social media has also made us more isolated. I know it's kind of a cliche to say this, but it's true. When you're scrolling through social media, of course people will put forth their best versions of themselves. They will show their
Yeah.
best life. They won't say, of course they won't want to post anything that makes themselves look bad, but what this creates is a sort of like illusion that when you scroll through social media you think that everyone's life is perfect when they're actually not, and this will actually have a huge impact on self-esteem and how you feel the world. You kind of feel bad about yourself because you're like, why can't my life be like them? And definitely I think this kind of leads to a kind of withdrawal from social interaction, and withdrawal from just facing people as a whole, because you kind of feel bad about yourself and you don't really think that you're worthy of discussing and communicating with other people. So yes, I think definitely I think so would you say you're leaning more towards us as humanity is more disconnected in a way? Because I guess, like, from what you've said, at least from what I've heard, it's definitely a good ideal that people are connected, but would you say that ultimately we're disconnected individuals from each other?
Right, because when you're talking about globalization, I suddenly think of that, that phrase 分久必合，合久必分.
Yeah.
Yeah, like basically what that means is like when we are like separated, it's kind of like a political phrase, and like in Chinese, and it's like when nations are more separated for a long time, eventually they'll come together, and when they have come together for a long time, eventually they will dissolve and like separate their ways once again. So I think it's kind of like an interesting cycle, because when you're together you think about your self-interest, but when you're isolated you think about what you can do, the possibilities you can do if you just come together. But regarding your question, I do think that now in society we definitely have become increasingly disconnected, even though for me I hope that someday we can be more connected.
Yeah. So, definitely, I think it's definitely like a goal that I think humanity should reach, about how to be more united and to value our similarities more than the differences that separate us. Although now I say this, I find myself sounding quite communist, but anyways, let's moving on. Well, whatever you may think, now we're going to explore one of the most convincing arguments for proving that individuals are ultimately isolated, which is a concept known as qualia. So, in layman's term, qualia refers to the phenomenon that we cannot accurately and fully communicate our sense experience, since all our experiences are inherently subjective. So, for example, Telia, let's try a little experiment, shall we? So, try to
Okay.
describe the experience of a headache to me without using the words headache or pain. So, assuming that I'm a person who has never suffered a headache or pain before.
Basically your head is just seems like something is squeezing you.
Okay.
And yeah, I guess I can't use pain, so I don't know. Like, yeah, something is squeezing you. But then if you don't experience pain, you don't know what the squeezing you feel like. Like,
I think the same goes for a lot of different things. For example, like, oh, try to describe a color to me, or try to describe these kind of different experiences. So we have like visual experiences, we have tactile experience like pain. So I think, as you can see, the general idea is that it's very difficult for Telia to communicate what a headache is like to me, and it has been found that verbal and written language do not have the capacity or capabilities to express individual experiences, which must be experienced by oneself. And we'll discuss more about this later when we cover the topic of language and its limitations in expressing trauma, and how our language failed us in some way, that it may not be a perfect way of communication, since it does omit some messages that we would like to communicate. And the reason for this is that because the senses of one person and another person are ultimately disconnected to each other. So, we're bringing back to the idea that human beings are, one can argue that human beings are isolated islands, and unable to establish any meaningful communication, in the sense that we're not able to express qualia, we're unable to express individual experience that we experience by ourselves. And there is even a Chinese idiom describing this phenomenon called 慢人摸象. So it's known as the blind man, and it's known as like the analogy of the blind man and the elephant. So the gist is that it is a parable that a group of blind men are touching different parts of an elephant, and they all have different impressions of what an elephant is like. So the idea is that because they're all touching different parts of the elephant, they all have different ideas of what an actual elephant looks like. So of course, this will bring forth different it brings out the disparity between individual human beings, and how, because of our disconnected senses, we're unable to really effectively communicate in the way. And also linking back to our ideas before, because we because, as we said, there could be a lot of things that prevent us from actually interpreting the truth or the environment around us. So we've covered illusions, we've covered how different interpretation of the information could also lead to different outcomes. So this idea is that we as human beings are inherently disconnected, and it's very hard for us to really communicate with each other, because of these different varying and different varieties in our ability to interpret and to sense our surroundings and the world around us. So there's based on this fact, there's actually a kind of phenomenon that people kind of fear, this connectivity. So this you can even see this reflected in Western culture, where there is a very famous creepypasta called "The Gateway of the Mind" that showcases the horrors of having all your senses cut off from the outside world. So I won't go through too much in it, but essentially it's a horror story about how it's about the imagination, about a fictional world where a person has all its senses cut off from the outside world, and how there's a incredible sense of loneliness, how there's an incredible sense of boredom could actually drive one towards insanity. So if you guys are interested, I'll actually link it down below. Although, fair warning, it is actually quite upsetting and maybe perhaps not too suitable for our younger audience. So I would say read at your own risk. So yeah, so this is basically our end of our podcast today. So today we've talked about first of all, senses and perception, how senses could affect how we see the world, and also how our interpretation of the world around us could affect how information could be interpreted. We also introduced you to the idea of qualia, of how there's a very convincing argument that when thinking about whether people are disconnected or not, it's just an argument of how we are disconnected because we're unable to use verbal written language. We're unable to use certain tools to communicate individual experiences. So thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. And in our next episode, we're going to talk more about how our senses affect the way we obtain knowledge and construct the reality around us. So please keep an eye out for new episodes, and we'll see you next time on The Uncommon Senses.